All right, good afternoon. It's August 4th, 2021, and this is a re-recorded version of the K-State Garden Hour. My name is Zac Hoppenstedt. I'm a horticulture extension agent with Kansas State University based in Johnson County. And due to some technical difficulties that we had during the live recording this afternoon, we decided to come in and present the webinar again, provide better audio quality, and we hope you all will enjoy. So we'll just start from the top. The topic for today's class is organic gardening, fairly broad topic area, but and we won't be able to go into minute detail for all the intricacies in organic crop production, but I would like to give you some of the broad strokes, and hopefully you'll leave with a better idea of what the national organic program looks like from USDA, as well as some of the techniques, both used in commercial farming, but that are also available to the backyard gardener as well. So we'll start with a little bit of history on the organic program. The beginning of organic is really still relatively young. Rodale Research Institute, based in Pennsylvania, were some of the the leaders in organic agriculture in the 1940s, and then saw quite a bit of activism around improved food quality and impact of pesticides in conventional farming in the 60s and 70s specifically, which kind of gave birth to the organic food movement as we know it today. It wasn't until 1990 that the US government got together and determined that they would like a standard to be developed. And it wasn't really until 2002 that we saw the first certification program and those shiny USDA organic stickers going out on produce items. So really relatively short period of time. And we've obviously, here at the Extension Office, we see increasing requests from growers that say they want to be organic. And there seems to be a connection there with increasing consumer trends. So we've seen over the last 2 decades, increased consumer demand for organic produce. It still makes up a relatively small percentage of the overall fruit and vegetable production industry, but steady growth, and an industry that's worth over $8.5 billion. And like I said, fruit and vegetable sales make up a major portion of that consumer demand, as well as meat, fish, poultry, snack foods, packaged processed items, dairy, a variety of different food items. But if someone had to define in narrow terms what is organic agriculture, perhaps the easiest way to describe it, and shortest way of doing that, would be saying that organic agriculture is defined by crop production that's done without synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, hormones, and does not allow for genetic modified organisms or GMOs. Organic farming is obviously a systems approach. I'll go into a little bit of what that means, but and some of the techniques that are appropriate for commercial agriculture, organic agriculture, for market, there are some parallels to what can be done in the garden. But in actually, in many ways, organic gardening allows for greater opportunity to produce food in greater concert with the natural environment, and to take even greater attention to detail, and be less reliant on chemical inputs. Definitely a purpose of the presentation is not to suppose any superiority of one sort of production system over another. As we go through this presentation, we'll definitely be focused on an optimistic view of organic agriculture and what the possibilities are, but it's definitely possible try to give you sort of a realistic lens to evaluate organic agriculture and realize that there are potential dangers to the environment, impacts to the natural environment, you could say, that are just as, there's a potential for that impact just as much in organic agriculture as there can be in conventional. And it just depends on how each producer or gardener approaches it. If it's really just substituting synthetic inputs for natural derived products, I think you're only realizing a small amount of what the overall intention is with the development of organic agriculture and the proponents for organic gardening and farming. And so I'd like to get a little bit more into the language that's provided by USDA that goes into a little bit more detail and steps away from it being just about allowable substances, synthetic versus natural. For a organic producer, they are typically farming a piece of land. They have to have avoided these types of synthetic substances for at least 3 years in order to qualify for organic certification. But the USDA defines organic production as being a method of farming that's focused on soil fertility and crop nutrition that would be managed through tillage and cultivation practices, crop rotations, which we'll talk about, cover crops, supplementing fertility with animal and crop waste materials, and using only National Organic Program approved materials. Crop pests, weeds, and disease should be controlled primarily through management practices, including physical, mechanical, and biological controls. A biological, botanical, or synthetic substance can be approved for that is approved by the National Organic Program can be used. One example of that would be something like a pheromone trap that is used either as a lure or to disrupt certain types of insect pests. And so they're able to synthesize the pheromones that those pests produce naturally. And through those types of trapping and monitoring, it can reduce the overall need for chemicals on the farm. And so that's an example of where a synthetic substance is actually approved because of its ability to reduce the need for insecticides on the farm. There are organic products that are not allowed in the National Organic Program. We always kind of make the joke that, snake venom is organic, but I don't want to farm with it. But there are other pesticides like rotenone, for example, that was allowed in organic production for many years and it attacked insects by affecting their nerve system, and in research trials looking at the effect on animals, it seemed like there was a potential for toxicity, and eventually the National Organic Program removed that substance from their certification. Another part of the National Organic Program is that you must use organic seeds and planting stock when available. Going into a little bit more detail, I promise these will be the most text-heavy slides throughout the presentation, but I do want to just go in a little bit more on how the National Organic Program is really a more holistic approach that has a lot to do with cultural practices and not just chemical inputs and how they're derived. So organic production should be an ecological production management system that promotes and enhances biodiversity, biological cycles, and soil biological activity. We'll talk a lot about soil biology and soil health in the presentation. It's based on minimal use of off-farm inputs and management practices that restore, maintain, and enhance ecological harmony. A system that's designed and managed by using, where possible, cultural, biological, mechanical methods, as opposed to using substances, and to fulfill any specific function within the system so as to maintain long-term soil fertility, increase soil biological activity, and ensure effective pest management, recycling waste to return nutrients to the land. Finally, organic production systems are managed to respond to site-specific conditions by integrating cultural, biological, mechanical practices that foster cycling of resources, promote ecological balance, and conserve biodiversity. That's a lot of words, and hopefully we'll start to get a better sense of what that looks like in practice. But to summarize, really, organic program is focused on feeding the soil and less so the plants, and making sure that we have good, diverse soil biology, making sure that we have good wildlife biology and a diversity of plants and animals, both in the farm and garden landscape, and then trying to reduce off-farm inputs as much as possible and sourcing things that are local and widely available organic materials in our environment, in our region. Some of the same techniques in many ways. Most gardeners are not necessarily out of any sort of not with necessarily a lot of intentional reasoning or any sort of politics behind choosing conventional organic agriculture. Most gardeners are able, because of their smaller scale, to be more observing more what's going on with their plants, provide more attention and care to individual plants, and are usually using a lower amount of chemical inputs than a commercial grower would, regardless of whether they are dedicated, unwavering organic or conventional. And so some of the same practices that we preach, just good gardening practices, adding organic matter to the soil as a source of fertility and a way to promote good soil biology, which can buffer some soil-borne disease and pests, is definitely a good approach. So adding a lot of organic materials from plant or animal residues, compost, making your own compost. When we talk about minimizing off-farm inputs, compost is one of the best examples of that, because obviously you're recycling food waste from your home and plant residues from the garden, and you're using that to promote soil health and fertility for your plants. Using organic fertilizers, we'll talk a little bit in more detail about the comparison in between organic and conventional fertilizers, and then green manures like cover crops. So using living plant material for mulches, and also to keep our soil covered, prevent erosion, promote soil life all times of the growing season. Looking at soil fertility, organic fertilizers are composed of natural materials, usually from animal or plant waste, sometimes mined minerals with little or no processing. Processed fertilizers are manufactured from refined or natural materials like rock or animal or petroleum products. These would be things like ammonium sulfate, ammonium phosphate, potassium sulfate, most of like urea, most of the widely available garden fertilizers. However, using an organic product brings more into the soil usually than just the macronutrient that the plant needs to grow. It's feeding the soil and bringing in some organic matter, and has typically more biological activity to promote a diverse ecosystem in the soil. However, nitrogen is something that's sometimes difficult to get, and a lot of the soil samples that I see in my office coming from the northeast part of the state, we have lower levels of nitrogen because it's so mobile in the soil, whereas we have really high levels of phosphorus and potassium. And so just being mindful that even if you're selecting an organic product like manure or compost, you may be accumulating higher levels of that P and K from the NPK rating that we get on most of our fertilizer bags or commercial fertilizer products. And the same way that we want to avoid excess fertilizers, excess nutrients in the soil, which lead to runoff and algae blooms in our water systems. Those same negative impacts can come from adding excessive manures or compost year after year after year. So I really encourage even organic gardeners to submit a soil test to your local extension office. They usually can do that for low or no cost. Some of the more common strictly nitrogen-based fertilizers, which are usually what we recommend to 90% of the soil tests that we process in my office, would be things like soybean, cottonseed meal, blood meal, fish emulsion. Compost and manure are great soil amendments, but sometimes bring a lot of potassium and phosphorus as well. If your soil sample comes back and you see that you do need more P and K, these are just some examples of some of the commercial products that are available and the sort of the active ingredient or the primary compound in some phosphorus and potassium organic fertilizers. And Oregon State has a really great publication on the NPK ratings for a variety of different organic fertilizer products. If you're interested in learning more, you can follow that link. Another way to promote fertility, to manage weeds, to prevent erosion, and even create living mulches are with cover crops. So cover crops are generally grass grain plant species, leguminous species that are grown to cover the soil during fallow periods, especially in late fall and through early spring, some that overwinter, some that are winter killed, like peas and oats, but that still provide a ground cover, and then can be turned back into the soil, either with a broad fork or some light tillage to put that organic matter back in the soil. And with leguminous plants, that have the ability to fix nitrogen, taking atmospheric nitrogen and converting that into plant available sources of nitrogen. That's free fertilizer that you really are just really growing in your garden through the use of cover crops. So these are just some examples, some different mixes that you can use. Buckwheat is another really easy one to do during the summer. And tillage radish is kind of a fun one if you have very compacted soils and you don't really want to do a lot of tillage because you're trying to protect soil life and sequester as much carbon as you can. Using a taproot cover crop like a tillage radish can really break up the soil and add organic matter at the same time. Biodiversity is important not only in trying to promote beneficial insects, which we'll go into, but also really looking at the variety of crops that we grow in the garden. And if you tend to have a lot of pests and disease issues, you might consider trying to diversify the crop families that you're growing in your garden space. So realizing that there are botanical classifications of plant species, and these plant families that make up a majority of the fruit and vegetables that we eat. You know, there's a smaller subset of groups to which those plants fit into. And so things like, for example, potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, all belonging to the nightshade family, or things like garlic, onions, leeks, shallots, all belonging to the onion family. Things like cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, all being a part of a collective unit known as brassicas or cruciferous vegetables. And a lot of the same diseases and pest pressures for broccoli are going to carry over into cabbage or kale. And so just being mindful that you're trying to rotate in between some of these different plant families that are listed on the slide. And that'll help reduce your need for using, chemical inputs, regardless of whether they're organic or conventional. It's also really important to just select good plants. When I was in school, I had a professor, a plant pathologist who'd say, there's a difference between a pathogen and a disease. And so really what the pathogen is just the organism that attacks the plant given the right conditions. But there has to be the right host and there has to be the right environment. And so if you are a gardener that just has terrible issues with early blight or septoria on your tomatoes, it may not be the thing you want to hear, but the easiest thing to do would be to stop growing tomatoes and try growing, something with less disease pressure, like sweet potatoes or lettuce. But just keep in mind that really one of the easiest way to reduce our dependence on chemical inputs is to diversify what we grow in the garden, but also selecting disease-resistant varieties. So this is a picture from a seed catalog, just taking a look and seeing that we've got a few things highlighted in the seed catalog for these tomatoes, and you can see that there are these codes that they use here, LB, AB, B, F2, and what they're telling you is there's fusarium resistance with F, verticillium disease resistant with B, tomato mosaic virus is TMB, alternaria leaf blight with AB. And so it's telling you that these are plants that you can select if you've had these disease issues before. Another thing I'd highly recommend is take a look at recommended plant varieties from K-State, which are going to be locally adapted and proven high yielding crop varieties for a variety of different fruit and vegetables. And also selecting plants that are more suited to the soil type that we have here. So an example is like blueberries require very acidic soil type. We have a more basic or alkaline soil type. And so trying to be more organic, reducing your dependence on inputs, you may decide that it might be better to grow a native fruiting plant like elderberry or serviceberry rather than needing to do a huge soil amendment project and growing a couple acres of blueberries. But really making sure that your plants have the basics that all plants need for healthy growth, soil, sunlight, water, and nutrients. And sun means full sun. So this example of a garden that really is taking, putting some time and attention into making sure their plants are spaced correctly, which is going to promote good airflow, and it's going to reduce the incidence of disease. But then you have a third of the garden that's heavily shaded by a tree in the garden, and so those plants are going to get leggy and become more greatly susceptible for pest and disease pressures. But if we keep the plants fertilized, we plant them into a weed-free environment, and we give them adequate space, and in some cases support like trellis, that really can go a long way to reducing our needs for inputs and being more organic. So another thing is looking at weed management. It's extremely important that you, when it comes to organic production, you don't have a lot of chemical options. So even if you're trying, even if it gets to the point of no return and you feel like you're being overrun with weeds in the garden, I have all these pictures of the different hose that are at your disposal, because that is one of probably the best options for an organic grower, and getting good, understanding how to use different hand tools, when to use them, and getting weeds when they're small and can be easily disturbed and removed. And really starting to learn more about the difference in between when weed seeds germinate, making sure weeds don't go to flower, and seeing the difference between annual and perennial weeds. But hand tools, there are a few organic approved herbicides, and we'll go over those at the end. But they're not hugely effective, and cultural practices like cultivating with a hand tool is sometimes your best option. Using mulches, using tarps to make your garden bed absent of light and to kill off the to germinate seed underneath the tarp, and then to black out those plants so that they end up dying after germination. Using silage tarps or solarization in some cases can be effective at removing weed seed in the garden, and that's usually done with a clear plastic mulch. And so high temperatures are lethal to some weed species and not to others. So you have to be mindful and know what sort of weeds you're fighting and what the best approach is. Using organic mulches or biological mulches, like things that are derived from plant residues like straw, that can be great. But if you have issues with perennial weeds like Johnson grass, which will come up in the late spring and summer, early summer, they're surviving with their rhizomes underneath the soil, and so now you have all this straw and you have Johnson grass coming up, and the straw is just making it more difficult for you to remove those weeds. So part of being an organic grower is really being curious and learning about the pest issues that you have on your farm so that you can pick the best approach. Other options for mulches that would be a little bit more effective in that situation would be like landscaping fabric or even plastic mulches, which can reduce the growth of some perennial weed species. And if all else fails, some cover crops have the potential to outcompete weeds. They exude certain chemicals in their roots and tissues that can be what we call allelopathic, where they either prevent germination or they severely reduce the vigor of the competing weeds. And so just making sure that your soil is always covered can be a really good way to reduce the seed bank, because one weed can produce thousands of seeds if let go to flower. So doing everything you can to make sure that weeds don't go to flower and that you're keeping the beds covered. When it comes to diseases, cultural practices play a really large role as well. Making sure that you're picking disease-resistant varieties. If you have issues with powdery mildew on squash or cucumbers, making sure you're selecting varieties that have some resistance to powdery mildew. Understand the disease, its life cycle, when it's usually most prevalent in the environment, and where it's coming from. So for example, with soil-borne diseases, doing some pruning at the base of the plant so that water splashing against the soil and hitting the foliage at the base of the plant doesn't need to that you're reducing the environmental conditions that allow that to spread to your plant. And that's an example with tomatoes here, where they've pruned off the bottom leaves, creates really great airflow, and that can be, your best line of defense rather than any sort of fungicide. Good plant spacing, planting, the timing of your planting, knowing what the appropriate air and soil temperatures are for the crops that you're growing. For example, with tomatoes, we had usually we'd be recommending that folks plant tomatoes in the northeast part of the state around Mother's Day. This year, it was far too cold to be putting out warm season plants at that time. And so holding back, knowing that nighttime temperatures were going to get far below 50 degrees several nights for multiple weeks, and waiting closer to the end of May puts a lot less stress on that plant early in its life. And generally that equates into a healthier plant for the rest of the season. And using mulches in some cases to prevent splash from rain event can be really helpful. It's not totally 100% effective, but having the ground covered around the base of the plant can be helpful. Prevention is the key, though, especially with diseases. There are very few chemical products, even on the organic side or conventional side, that are curative. Most of them need to be used in a preventative way. We'll spend quite a bit of time here on insects and just kind of appreciating that there is no good bug or bad bug. You've got things like blister beetles, which are, can be the bane the backyard vegetable grower, but keep in mind that a blister beetle is also a predator and can eat up to 30 grasshopper eggs, which can also be a garden pest. Praying mantis is like the serial killer of the bug world. They're so voracious and manage a lot of insects in the garden environment. Asian lady beetle, which we kind of think of as being more of like a domestic pest that accumulate in the window sills inside our house. But just like we'll talk in a little bit more detail about ladybird beetles or the more traditional ladybug. But just the same, Asian lady beetles eat aphids, mites, thrips, scales, and even Lepidoptera eggs or caterpillar eggs. And so it goes on and on and on. Insect relationships are complex. There's not just good or bad insects. We just need to look at the roles that they play in the planet and in the garden. And looking at those roles, understanding that they're part of a food chain, food for birds, frogs, bats, lizards, and adult mosquitoes, for example, which nobody likes mosquitoes, but they're food for birds and insects. And as larvae, they're food for fish. Insects are also decomposers along with bacteria, fungi, and worms. They help recycle organic matter back into the soil. And obviously, one of the most important things we think about when protecting insects is that they're pollinators. They help set seed, set fruit, and then seed that we use for vegetable production as well as fruit production. And honeybees are not the only pollinators. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But yeah, just trying to achieve a balance, because when we have a healthy diversity of insects in the environment, they tend to regulate each other. Communities within the insect world. So you have plant eaters, and those are sometimes what we consider pests, like aphids and wireworms and leaf miners. Then you have decomposers, which we talked about previously. But then you have things like predators and parasitic insects. So predators are going to be things like ground beetles. These are carnivores. Ground beetles, robber flies. There are thousands of species of wasps, and these are insects that actually consume other insects. And then you have parasitic insects, which are specialized. They feed on both plant feeders and predators, and then they also they either spread diseases or they insert their eggs and larvae into insect hosts, and in that way eliminate those pests as they go through their life cycle. We'll play a little game here that I can't take 100% credit for, that a previous extension faculty had come up with. So we'll take a look at a few pictures like these, parent insect feeding on a redbud leaf that I know I was seeing a lot of this summer. And, I had my friends and family at home saying, what is this? What is this? Do I need to spray? But I had some caterpillars that were in the garden, and one that was on top of my parsley plant. And, people sending us emails into the extension office saying, I'm worried that these caterpillars are eating my parsley or my carrot crop. So are these problems? Another sort of larva caterpillar type thing. This maybe looks like that terrible cabbage blooper worm that I see that puts all the holes in my cabbage, but I'm not sure. This is terrifying. This is what is this? Is this a scorpion or something? I surely need to run out and get some sort of insecticide to manage that problem. And then this is overwhelming for sure. I've got some sort of eggs on these stems coming on. It almost looks like a fungus, and then tons of hatching insects all over the plant surface. Again, I have some sort of warthog scorpion, black and red. It's definitely concerning. All of these different insects that we're seeing out in the garden. This one is terrible. I mean, be honest, who would not be heading to the nursery for some bug spray after seeing this? All right, okay, that was a fun game. Now we'll actually identify what some of these photos were. From the first one, this redbud leaf damage, that was the alfalfa leafcutter bee. The leafcutter bee pollinates better than 20 honeybees. It cuts holes in the leaf line just to nest and to develop its nest. And this does usually is just cosmetic damage, and it's an incredible pollinator. The caterpillars that we saw, like this parsley worm, is the black swallowtail, and then the one above it is the tiger swallowtail. So these are just innocent bystanders that are pollinators in their adult stage. The larva that we saw that kind of looked like maybe it was a cabbage worm that we needed to spray for was actually a syrphid fly or a flower fly, and it's an important pollinator. It pollinates more than honeybees, and they feed on aphids. So you definitely wouldn't want to eliminate that from your garden if you saw it. And then that's sort of this kind of intimidating looking insect that was in the bottom left-hand corner here is the larva stage of a lacewing, which is one of the best all-purpose predators in the garden. It feeds on aphids, mealybugs, immature scale, whitefly, thrips, spider mites, and a lot of the plant pests that we are trying to control with chemical products. And they're sometimes called the aphid lion, and the adults feed on a lot of the same pest species. Lady beetles, I know that the first time when I was taking some entomology courses that I saw this was the pupal and larval stage of ladybugs, that I said, wow, I had no idea. And so ladybugs are aphid feeders. They're widely sold. You can purchase ladybugs to release in your garden or greenhouse. And so these are highly coveted beneficial insect. And now this one was really strange. We saw these, it looks like aphids, and is it an ant or something crawling over the tops? And some of these aphids are kind of bloated, almost maybe like mummy-like. Well, that's ant-looking thing was really a parasitic wasp. It is known as the aphid parasitoid, and it's probably the most important biological control that we have in the garden. The parasite also helps spread a fungus disease for aphids, which eliminates them. But as the females are crawling on the leaf surface where the aphids are, they're looking for the aphids they're a parasite of the aphids, and it curls its abdomen. The wasp curls its abdomen between its legs, and it stings or lays its eggs in the aphid. And it ultimately can parasitize up to 100 aphids during its brief life. These eggs hatch in 2 to 3 days, and then they start feeding inside of the aphid before ultimately killing it. And then that's why these aphids start to become sort of dried, like bloated and dried out mummies. And after the larval stage, the pupal stage, which takes about 4 to 5 days, a total of 2 weeks before emerging as an adult, it cuts a perfectly circular hole in the tops of these aphids, emerges, and then it repeats that same life cycle. So extremely important beneficial insect. Note the escape hatch cut into the back of each of these mummies. But something that important to understand is that insecticides and certain fungicides, regardless of if they're organic or conventional, can kill adult wasps. as well as immature wasps when they're inside the aphids. And in many cases, the predatory insects will be easily killed by the insecticides, whereas the aphids may have some resistance because they've been exposed to some of these products in previous generations, and may only be partially killed by the insecticide. And so they'll end up repopulating, whereas the parasitic wasp actually will not. So lessons to be learned from that really enthralling game or exercise, if you will, is that most gardens, approximately a majority of all the wildlife that we have in the garden space, insects included, are beneficial, far more than the pest populations. And if they're allowed to increase throughout the growing season, they can reduce pest populations of things like moths and aphids by up to 20 or 40%. So being able to recognize beneficial insects, and we only scratch the surface on all the beneficial insects that are in the garden, but it's just important to recognize that sometimes when we see damage and then we see this bug, this thing crawling on the leaves, it's not necessarily a problem. But another thing to keep in mind, and this photo is kind of representing that, trying to create insectaries in the garden, areas where insects can take up habitat, where there's plants that are flowering all year long or all season long, using things like the crimson clover that's in the picture in between planting rows, things like buckwheat, alyssum, hyssop. And I know that there will be an upcoming class on attracting beneficials to the garden, where they'll go into more detail on the plant species. The Xerces Society is an organization dedicated to promoting insect diversity in the landscape and in the environment. And they have some great guides, and that habitat planning for beneficial insect is great. If you haven't checked that out, you definitely should. So don't look at it as us versus them. Keep in mind that the healthier your plants are, the more that you execute well on those cultural practices that we've discussed, the less susceptible plants usually are for pests and disease. There's research to suggest that when plants are stressed, they emit these biochemical signals, which attract, these predators, pathogens. And so trying to start with a healthy plant from the get-go, healthy seed, healthy transplant, planted into weed-free, mulched, well-watered area. And one thing we didn't really talk about is when it comes to watering, trying to keep leaf surfaces dry as much as possible, because that ends up creating a good habitat for disease development. So always watering at the base of the plant was a cultural practice that we kind of skipped over. Last kind of wrap up on recognizing that there are beneficials, and thinking twice before feeling like you need to intervene with any sort of chemical, organic, or conventional. Act like a doctor, and remember the first order is do no harm. If doing nothing is too much trouble, then you need to gather information. You need to be a researcher. You are working in a relatively small space. Identify the bug, work with your extension office, send in photos. Do you really need to kill it? What's the best way to do it? Is it by attracting beneficials? Is it by using a natural-based product? And how much damage can you tolerate? Do you really need to interfere? Commercial growers have what we call economic thresholds. And so that's the amount of pests on each plant. What limit is required? Like how much impact does this pest need to have before it's actually economically important for me to intervene? Is it really going to affect the production of my plants? A good rule of thumb is, if more than a third of the plant is defoliated or presenting some sort of disease or dying tissues, then that's usually a good rule of thumb to know that you probably need to be doing something. But anything less than that, the plant can usually tolerate some damage. And then ultimately, if you do decide that you've educated yourself on what the pest or disease issue is, and you're scouting early and often, you're out in the field regularly, touching your plants, turning leaf sides upside down. The earlier you can catch problems, the better chance that you'll have of being effective in whatever intervention you have. But if you educate yourself, if you're curious and pursue the inquiry fully, then you'll be able to make an informed decision on what sort of perhaps input that you want to use in that situation. A little bit more on some of the cultural interferences that can be done that are a little bit more advanced, I would say, than just the beginning gardening stuff, like weeding and mulching and watering. Obviously, going out and scouting regularly, like I talked, and physical removal of insects can be really effective, especially if you can catch those populations early. Knocking off Japanese beetles into soapy water, going out and picking squash bugs. If you're in a small enough space, that can be an effective tool. The two brick method is what it's sometimes colloquially called. But then creating barriers is one of the most important tools that organic growers use. So that can be netting, that can be a clay dust product like the one that you can see here, where it's a wettable powder that's sprayed on the surface of the apple fruits. That creates a rough surface and it can be prevented for both disease and insects if applied regularly, using sticky traps or pheromone traps so that you can identify when the pests are becoming present in the garden. And then that is also an indicator. As soon as you know they're there, or the adults are there and that they might be laying eggs, then there are some really relatively low toxic inputs like insecticidal soaps or horticultural oils that really are only effective at the early stages of that pest's biological cycle. So in that way, using sticky traps both as a monitoring device, but also to capture and eliminate pests in the early stages. Strong spray of water, it kind of is contradictive to keeping the leaf surfaces dry. But what I would say is that that if you can do a strong spray of water, especially early in the morning, where you give time for the leaf surfaces to dry out, that can be really effective on things like aphids and spider mites. And you may have to do that a few times, but it's definitely one of the more environmentally friendly ways to address those types of pests. Row covers, these are more or less glorified blankets for plants. You can support them with PVC hoops or tubing or wire. They come in both sort of a polyester fabric. Those are some of the trade names that they're sold under, varying different heaviness of fabric, some that are more suited for summer, some that are more suited for winter, and actually providing trapping heat so that seeds can germinate, or you can be harvesting plants later into the winter, planting transplants earlier in the spring. You have this nylon netting like Protect Net, which will last far longer, has a lot more durability. It's made out of a nylon material and is a very fine netting that can exclude even the smallest insect pests. And so using like a row cover like this on something like squash plants can really can make it so that you never have establishment of cucumber beetles or squash bugs or squash vine borer, especially if you can get them on early. Now they do need to be removed with with traditional varieties of cucumbers and melons, as soon as those plants start to flower, you'll need to remove that cover. But there are varieties that don't actually require pollinators. They're called parthenocarpic varieties of squash, and those are plants that can be covered all season long. So those exclusion methods can be really effective. So pesticides should always be considered a last resort. Prevention through cultural practices is definitely preferred. Tolerance of damage is something that you need to think about, and you know, observe as you start to become more experienced in your gardening. You'll start to know, like, how much flea beetle damage can my eggplant really tolerate, and do I really need to spray? Chemical applications are always the last resort. Select the correct product for control, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the products that are available for organic producers, but also knowing the correct timing. These are some of the labels that you're going to see on products that are approved for organic production. The OMRI label, Organic Material Review Institute, and then the EPA listed pesticide symbol. So they're not always going to have these labels on them. You can visit both EPA and OMRI's website to confirm whether the product is certified for organic. But generally, those are good indicators that the product is for organic production. Like I said, there are not a lot of organic approved herbicides. They are usually going to be contact herbicides or burned down. So they need to make good contact, and they need to have good coverage. And they're mostly going to be acidic products. So vinegar, clove oil, citric acid, and they will burn the above ground portion of the plant. But for perennial weeds or weeds that are able to send up new shoots, these are only going to be effective for a short period of time. And in my personal opinion, I'd much rather take the time to take out a stirrup hoe and cut the roots from underneath the plant early on. Is probably going to be much more effective than using some of these organic herbicides, which are also expensive. I will mention corn gluten meal really briefly. It's a byproduct of corn processing, and it has some nitrogen in it. Can be used in like a turf lawn. It also has been effective in preventing germination of certain weed seeds in turf lawns. So that's definitely something to look at, and can be used in the garden as well if applied after the crop has already established itself. You wouldn't want to seed vegetables and then put down corn gluten meal, but after plants have been established, this can be somewhat effective. Fungicides, you're mostly looking at sulfur and copper. Copper is kind of being phased out. These are products that have to be used at regular intervals. You need to know what disease, what sort of disease you're trying to prevent, and you need to know what the environmental conditions are for that disease. And then, are you willing to make repeat applications on 7, 10, 14-day intervals? Sulfur, copper, there are some horticultural and neem oils that can be effective fungicides, even the kaolin clay product that we mentioned earlier. There are some beneficial microbes, bacteria like Bacillus subtilis, trichoderma. These are competitive beneficial microbes, and they can both compete and suppress fungal diseases. But like I said, you know, these are going to be sometimes very expensive products, especially on the microbial side. And then at the very least, just require multiple applications. Like in the picture, I always like to show this example, cedar apple rust. So we're seeing all these, you know, kind of ugly lesions on our apple leaves. And we think, oh no, my apple tree is going to die. But really, this disease is extremely prevalent. Could you prevent this? Yes, but this disease is mainly cosmetic and does not affect the fruit. And so do you want to spend time and money going out and doing sprays? And you know, the net benefit is relatively low in that case. So educate yourself on what the disease is and whether it's really necessary. On insecticides, some of the, I guess, oil mineral products that are available, horticultural oils, which really just smother the eggs. You have those that are available for both the dormant period that are kind of heavier oils, and then lighter oils that are better for the summer and aren't quite as phytotoxic, won't burn the leaves. Anytime the product is oil-based, if temperatures are high in the heat of the summer, applying those during the day, you have to be very careful. You usually want to be doing that in very limited quantities and early in the morning, because you can burn the heck out of your plants, the good plants that you're trying to grow. Diatomaceous earth is another one that's really popular. It's basically made of natural glass or silica, and it can be applied at the base of the plant. And so when soft-bodied insects like slugs pass over the top of it, it makes small cuts in their bodies, and then they ultimately end up drying out. Kaolin clay, we've mentioned now several times. It sounds like it's a panacea, but it has limited effects. If it's used regularly, especially on fruit, it can repel or irritate insects or even disrupt their feeding and egg laying. On the microbials, so there are, pest pathogens, so bacterias and fungi that actually are pathogens for the pests that we're trying to eliminate. Two of the most common would be Bt products, or Bacillus thuringiensis. They're really, I would say, widely used because, or are really embraced by the organic gardening community, because they are selective rather than broad spectrum. They really focus largely on insects in the Lepidoptera or caterpillar larvae, such as imported cabbage moth. And so they are not as much of a risk for something like a honeybee or some pollinators, but they can affect caterpillars for some butterflies. So you have to be careful that you're only applying that product. It can be applied as a spray or as a powder, but just be mindful that it won't be selective with caterpillar species. Spinosad is another also bacterium byproduct produced by bacteria, natural product, and it is a contact insecticide that can control caterpillars and thrips. I believe its residual toxicity is a little lower than another contact insecticide that we'll mention here after. But that, like I said, good for flea beetles, Colorado potato beetle, that can be rotated with Bt products. You can also, like I said, purchase a lot of the beneficials or natural enemies. There are commercial insectaries that sell things like parasitic nematodes, which are sub-microscopic worms that live in the soil and on the tops of leaf tissues. They can be done as a soil drench or sprayed onto plants, and they are basically predators of certain types of grubs. You also have milky spore, which is another biological product that you can use to drench your soils and will attack grubs like Japanese beetle. But I haven't used it a lot, and I think how effective those products are for a home garden is probably marginal. But yeah, you have access to insectaries that sell these, but make sure that you're buying direct from the insectary, because you want to make sure that it's shipped, expedited shipping, and that it's stored correctly, and that you know how to use it immediately. These work better in closed environments like high tunnels or greenhouses, and really widely used for nurseries. But when they're exposed to an open environment, they can be, the effect can be short-lived. So Pyrethrum is extremely is a widely used organic insecticide. It's derived from chrysanthemums, which sounds like, wow, that's like the most organic thing ever, but it's a nerve toxin, and it kills on contact, and it can control aphids, whiteflies, and a lot of the insect pressures that we have in the garden, but it can also be lethal to pollinators. And so you need to be applying a product like that, like I said, as a last resort, early in the morning, late in the evening, when pollinators aren't active, not around open blossoms or flowering plants. Neem oil is another one that is listed as a fungicide, insecticide, even as maybe even as an herbicide, I think, at times. But it is an extract from the neem tree. Azadirachtin is the primary compound. It interferes in its use as an insecticide. It interferes with the life cycle of insects, their feeding, their molting, mating and egg laying. But this is another one that you would want to be careful. It can also be toxic for honeybees. And then there's another product called Azera, which is a mix of the Pyrethrum or the chrysanthemum-derived insecticide, and then the compound in neem. And those combined can be really effective for commercial organic producers, mostly against beetles, aphids, imported cabbage worm, leafhoppers, and cucumber beetles. But that's not something that I would necessarily recommend for the home grower. The plant extracts and essential oils, they disrupt insect neuroreceptors. They're anti-feedants, so they make it so that the insects don't want to actually feed on the leaf surfaces. But just like I said, be careful. Anything that's oil-based, especially in high temperatures, hot weather, direct sunlight, they can definitely burn plant surfaces. Soaps and oils, once again, they provide knockdown of soft-bodied insects like aphids and mites, but require repeat applications. They're really effective, like insecticidal soaps, which you can make your own insecticidal soap at home, but usually the products that you buy are designed so that they don't have any additives. But if you've ever taken a bath with Dawn dish soap and you know how it dries you out, it does the same thing to insects, but it's harder for them to recuperate. And if you do it at certain stages of their life cycle, then it can be effective. But usually, at the egg stage and some of the early larva instar stages of some of these insects, insecticidal soaps can be effective, but requires you to be scouting and to apply the product at a very specific time. All right, so in summary, there are three main points that I want you guys to walk away with. Organic gardening should be about improving soil health, encouraging biological diversity, and reducing off-farm inputs. So those last, 5-7 slides about all the different organic products, I think that is really, I would encourage you to not focus so much on becoming an organic gardener is using a product that has an organic label on it. It's really about being less dependent on chemical inputs and products that you have to purchase. Consuming less, using more local resources, trying to create more diversity in your garden, creating more habitat for beneficial wildlife. If you do have to use a pesticide, choose wisely and use it carefully. Think about long-term impacts. This is just some information. You can find my contact information at the johnsoncounty.kstate.edu website. You can contact our gardener hotline anytime, Monday through Friday, 8:30 to 5. Email us 24/7. Some more information about National Organic Program and Organic Material Review Institute. And then I did provide the link as well for K-State Horticulture Info Center, which has incredible publications on everything from identifying garden pests. This Kansas Garden Guide is also available there, and it is a comprehensive manual on all the best practices for successful vegetable gardening, recommended varieties for fruits and for vegetables, all available at that info center. When it comes to insect identification, in addition to working with your extension office, I highly recommend a few publications: Garden Insects of North America by Whitney Crenshaw, and then the Natural Enemies book, The Illustrated Guide to Biological Pest Control by Mary Louise Flint. So with that, I know that this is a photo of the work of the woodhouse toad in the vegetable garden at the extension office. If you're ever in Olathe, Tuesdays, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m., you can find me or one of my colleagues working out in the garden at our extension office there. And we'd love to meet you and interact with you in the garden. And I know that we'll be answering a lot of questions that came in through the webinar this afternoon, as well as any questions that come in here on YouTube or anywhere else that you find this video. So thank you again, and thanks for your patience with the technical difficulties this afternoon. I hope that you have a successful fall garden, and we'll see you soon at the next Kansas K-State Garden Hour, which will be next week. See you then. Thanks.